January 17, 1944. Château de la Roche-Guyon, France. 0530 hours. The stone walls of the medieval fortress held the winter cold like a clenched fist. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood at the narrow window overlooking the Seine Valley, watching dawn break over occupied France with the precision of a man who had learned to measure time in tactical increments. Steam rose from his coffee cup, real coffee, a luxury even for generals in the fourth year of total war. Below him, the Atlantic wall stretched from Norway to Spain, a concrete monument to German engineering and strategic doctrine. Rommel believed in this wall. He had bet his reputation on it. In the silence before the chateau stirred to life, he could almost convince himself that mathematics and reinforced concrete could stop what was coming. The Atlantic Wall was not merely a defensive position. It was an ideology rendered in steel and poured concrete, a physical manifestation of Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. From 1942 onward, the Reich had poured 1.2 million tons of steel and 17 million cubic meters of concrete into 15,000 fortified positions along 5,000 kilometers of coastline. Rommel himself had driven this acceleration after his appointment as Inspector of Coastal Defenses in late 1943. He knew what his Führer refused to accept, that Germany could not win a prolonged two-front war, that the invasion would come, and that everything depended on throwing the Allies back into the sea within 48 hours of landing. The war will be won or lost on the beaches, he told his officers. We'll have only one chance to stop the enemy, and that's while he's in the water, struggling to get ashore. But Rommel's wall had a fatal assumption embedded in its very foundation, that the enemy would come from the sea alone, that the invasion would follow predictable patterns of amphibious assault, that Wehrmacht doctrine, forged in the Blitzkrieg victories of 1939 and 1940, could respond faster than Allied forces could consolidate their beachhead. This assumption was rooted in German military experience, where rapid mechanized response had become almost instinctual. The panzers had rolled through Poland in 27 days, through France in 6 weeks. Speed, concentration of force, interior lines of communication, these were the principles that had made the Wehrmacht seemingly invincible. The Atlantic Wall defenders expected to fight on familiar terms, a visible enemy approaching from a predictable direction, time to mass forces, opportunity to counterattack with the precision that had broken British and Soviet offensives for 3 years. What they did not expect, what their tactical imagination could not quite encompass, was that on the night of June 5, 1944, the sky itself would become an avenue of invasion. June 6, 1944. 0016 hours. The night sky over Normandy. The rumble began as something felt rather than heard, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the darkness itself. German sentries along the coastal fortifications looked up, confused, reaching for binoculars and field glasses. The sound grew, not the familiar throb of Luftwaffe night fighters or the distinctive engines of RAF bombers on their way to German cities, but something else, something massive and sustained. Then they saw them, hundreds of aircraft, twin-engine transports catching moonlight as they emerged from cloud cover at 1,500 feet. C-47 Skitrans. American. Flying in formations so tight and numerous they seemed to blacken the stars. Captain Wilhelm von Gauberg, stationed at a Wehrmacht observation post near St. Miraglís, watched the sky fill with parachutes. It was like snow falling upward, he would later tell interrogators. Except the snow was men, and they fell everywhere, into our fields, onto our roads, behind our positions, in places no invasion plan should have put them. The mathematics of it defied his tactical training. Not a company. Not a battalion. An entire army descending from darkness. 13,000 Allied paratroopers, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, dropped behind the Atlantic Wall in the first hours of D-Day. Another 7,000 British and Canadian paratroopers landed simultaneously on the eastern flank. This was not a raid or a commando operation. This was vertical envelopment on a scale never before attempted in military history. The drops were scattered, chaotic, plagued by low clouds and anti-aircraft fire that dispersed the formations across 50 square miles of Norman bocage. Paratroopers landed in flooded fields, in orchards, tangled in power lines and church steeples. Some drowned in the marshes that Rommel himself had ordered flooded as a defensive measure. Others landed miles from their objectives, disoriented and alone. By conventional military standards, the drops were a tactical disaster. But in their very chaos lay a strategic brilliance that German commanders could not immediately grasp. Château de la Roche-Guyon. 0145 hours. The first reports reached Rommel's headquarters in fragmentary bursts. Paratroopers near Corentin. Enemy forces behind WN-62. Communications disrupted. Request reinforcements. The duty officer plotted each report on the situation map with mounting confusion. The pins spread across the map like a disease, with no apparent pattern, no clear objective. This violated everything in German tactical doctrine. Airborne forces were supposed to secure specific objectives: bridges, crossroads, command posts. These paratroopers seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, a diffusion of force that made no operational sense. Rommel was not there to see it. He had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday, confident that the weather would prevent any invasion attempt for several days. In his absence, subordinate commanders struggled to respond to an invasion that did not match their mental models of how invasions should unfold. The instinct was to concentrate forces, to mass armor for a decisive counterattack against the beaches. But behind the beaches, in the darkness of Norman villages and hedgerows, American paratroopers were cutting telephone wires, blocking roads, ambushing convoys, creating a chaos that multiplied far beyond their actual numbers. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt, commanding the 6th Parachute Regiment, recognized what was happening faster than most. He had commanded German paratroopers in Crete and understood airborne operations from the inside. "They are not trying to hold ground," he told his staff. "They are creating uncertainty. Every road we must check, every report we must verify, every small engagement pulls resources away from the beaches. They have turned our entire rear area into a battlefield." Von der Heydt was among the first German commanders to grasp that the Americans had not made tactical mistakes. They had weaponized confusion itself. The expectation and the reality. German military theory had prepared its officers to fight a certain kind of enemy. The Wehrmacht had spent 3 years on the Eastern Front fighting an opponent whose courage was unquestioned but whose coordination and logistics were frequently compromised by rigid Soviet doctrine. They had fought the British in North Africa, brave but constrained by limited resources and overly cautious command structures. German officers expected American forces to be wealthy but soft, materially rich but lacking the fighting spirit forged in existential struggle. "They are shopkeepers and farmers," one panzer commander told his men before D-Day. "They have never experienced real war on their soil. When they face true hardship, they will break." The reality that emerged in the Norman darkness shattered this comfortable prejudice. American paratroopers, scattered and disoriented, did not surrender or panic. They adapted. Officers and NCOs used cricket clickers, cheap metal toys that produced a distinctive double click, to identify friendlies in the darkness. Isolated soldiers formed ad hoc units under whoever held the highest rank or showed the most initiative. A lieutenant from the 101st Airborne, separated from his company, gathered 17 men from 4 different regiments and successfully held a crossroads for 6 hours against a German mechanized column. When ammunition ran low, they withdrew through hedgerows, reformed, and attacked again from a different angle. This was not the behavior of pampered troops encountering real war for the first time. The Germans discovered that American soldiers carried a material abundance that revealed not wealth but a philosophical difference in how democracies wage war. Each paratrooper jumped with 60 to 90 pounds of equipment, multiple weapons, ammunition far exceeding German loads, medical supplies, rations, radios, even toilet paper. A German sergeant searching a captured American position near Saint-Cum-du-Mont found something that troubled him more than the weapons: individual first aid kits, one for each soldier, containing morphine, sulfa powder, and bandages. "In our army," he wrote in a letter discovered after the war, "only officers and medics carry such things. Here, every man has the equipment to save his comrade's life. What kind of army values each soldier so highly?" This abundance was not accidental. It reflected an industrial capacity that Germany could no longer match, but more fundamentally, it reflected a society that treated individual soldiers not as expendable components, but as valued citizens in uniform. American tactical doctrine emphasized initiative and independent action at the lowest levels. German doctrine emphasized obedience and coordination within a strict command hierarchy. When that hierarchy fractured in the chaos behind the Atlantic Wall, German units often froze, waiting for orders that never came. American units, scattered far beyond any possible coordination with higher command, fought on because their training assumed they would be on their own. The sound of democracy. If there was one sound that defined the American airborne invasion, one auditory symbol that recurred in German after-action reports and prisoner interrogations, It was the metallic click of the M1 Garand rifle. Unlike the German Mauser K98K bolt-action rifle, the Garand was semi-automatic, capable of firing 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. The distinctive ping of the empty end-block clip ejecting became, for German soldiers, the sonic signature of American firepower. One veteran of the 91st Luftland Division recalled, "You would hear that clicking sound, very rapid, like someone typing very fast, and you knew an American position was near. Our rifles required 4 motions between shots: bolt up, bolt back, bolt forward, bolt down. There's required only one: pull the trigger again." The Garand represented more than mechanical superiority. It embodied a tactical philosophy that the individual rifleman, properly equipped, could generate decisive firepower without waiting for machine gun support or artillery preparation. In the close-quarters fighting of the Norman hedgerows, where engagements often occurred at distances of 30 meters or less, this advantage was profound. German squads were built around the MG-42 machine gun, with riflemen supporting the gun. American squads distributed firepower across all 8 men, each with a semi-automatic rifle. When German commanders tried to respond to paratroop positions in the traditional way, suppressing with machine gun fire while riflemen maneuvered, they discovered that the entire American squad could generate suppressing fire while moving and fighting simultaneously. This was the material manifestation of a deeper truth that German ideology had blinded itself to, that democracies at war could outproduce, out-innovate, and out-adapt authoritarian systems because they trusted initiative at lower levels and valued the judgment of common soldiers. The Reich had built its military on the myth of superior will and racial destiny. By dawn, as the first landing craft hit Omaha and Utah beaches, Rommel was racing back to France, his staff car speeding through roads already congested with confused reports and conflicting orders. When he arrived at headquarters, the map told a story his experience struggled to comprehend. The beaches were in Allied hands. Behind them, a zone of chaos 50 kilometers deep disrupted every attempt to mass panzer divisions for counterattack. Roads were blocked. Communications were severed. Units reported contact with enemy forces in villages that should have been secure rear areas. The 352nd Infantry Division, positioned to throw invaders back into the sea, was fighting in 3 directions simultaneously: forward against the beaches, sideways against British airborne at the eastern flank, and backward against American paratroopers who seemed to materialize from hedgerows and orchards with unnerving unpredictability. "Where is their center of gravity?" Rommel demanded. "Where do I strike to collapse their position?" The operations officer had no answer. There was no center of gravity. The Americans had deliberately created a distributed, resilient system where the loss of any unit or position did not compromise the whole. This was not how the Wehrmacht had been trained to think about warfare. In the weeks that followed, German generals who had commanded armies across Europe with devastating effectiveness found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by a force they had underestimated. The 82nd and 101st Airborne, reinforced and reorganized after their chaotic drops, held key terrain and anchored the Allied lodgment, while follow-on forces poured through the beaches. The panzer divisions that were supposed to drive the invaders back into the Channel never achieved the massed, decisive counterattack that German doctrine required. They arrived piecemeal, were ground down piecemeal, and ultimately withdrew, not routed, but defeated by an enemy who fought differently than expected and who possessed resources that seemed, to German eyes, inexhaustible. General Gunther von Kluge, who replaced Rommel after the field marshal was wounded in an Allied air attack, confessed to his staff, "We were prepared to fight the enemy we knew, the enemy we had defeated in 1940. But these Americans are not that enemy. They learn, they adapt, and they have such material superiority that even our tactical victories cost more than we can afford." It was not a statement about courage or will. It was a recognition that the fundamental equation of the war had shifted, and that Germany's tactical excellence could not overcome strategic disadvantages rooted in industrial capacity, technological innovation, and a military culture that empowered rather than merely commanded its soldiers. Epilogue: The Sky That Changed Everything. 70 years after that June night, a retired Wehrmacht officer was interviewed for a documentary. He had been a young lieutenant in 1944, commanding a machine gun section near Corentin. The interviewer asked what he remembered most about D-Day. The old man was silent for a long moment, then said, "The sky full of parachutes. We had been told that America was weak, that its soldiers were soft, that we were the master race destined to rule. And then I watched 13,000 men jump from airplanes into the darkness, into enemy fire, into uncertainty, and not one of them hesitated. That took a kind of courage we were not supposed to believe they possessed. In that moment, I think many of us understood, even if we could not admit it, that we were going to lose. Not because they were stronger soldiers, I still believed we were better trained, but because their country could send 13,000 men into the night sky and have another 13,000 ready to follow if those failed. That is not weakness. That is the strength of a nation that believes its cause is just and its citizens are worth any expense. The Atlantic Wall still stands in fragments along the French coast, concrete bunkers slowly crumbling into beaches where tourists now sunbathe. Rommel's fortress, built to stop an invasion from the sea, was rendered obsolete by men falling from the sky. The mathematics of it, 13,000 paratroopers against hundreds of thousands of defenders, should not have worked. But war is not merely mathematics. It is will and resources and ideas about what kind of society is worth fighting for. On that June night, democracy did not just fight fascism. It outthought it, outproduced it, and ultimately proved that free people, trusted with initiative and equipped with abundance, could achieve what authoritarian efficiency said was impossible. The clicking sound of the M1 Garand has long since faded from Norman hedgerows. But the lesson it taught, that societies which trust their citizens tend to win against societies that merely command them, echoes still through every serious study of why the Atlantic Wall fell and why the men who dropped from the darkness could not be stopped by concrete or doctrine or desperate courage. Freedom, it turned out, was not a weakness to be exploited. It was a weapon Germany never learned to counter.